Welcome, everyone. My name is Carlos Soler Rodriguez, a Ramon y Cajal Fellow at the University of Jaén, and it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our final speaker of the conference, Professor Sebastian Oberthur. Professor Oberthur is Professor for Environment and Sustainable Development and Director of the Research Center for Environment and Economy and Energy at the Brussels School of Governance. He is also a Professor of Environmental Policy and Law at the Center for Climate Change, Energy and Environmental Law at the University of Eastern Finland. He is a leading expert in international and EU environmental and climate governance and has extensive work on key areas such as the compliance and effectiveness of environmental regimes, the institutional interplay in international governance, or the EU's role in global climate diplomacy and environmental leadership. Professor Oberthur's research is frequently cited in top journals in environmental politics and governance. Beyond academia, he has also served as an advisor to the European Commission, national governments, as well as international organizations, shaping policies through science-based insights. Today, he will be speaking on a very highly relevant, timely topic, the European Green Deal, the Fit-for-55 package, and the future of EU climate governance. To briefly set the context, the European Green Deal is the European Union's overarching strategy to transition towards a climate-neutral economy and society by 2050. Complementing this is the Fit-for-55 package, a set of laws designed to achieve a 55% reduction in net greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. This package operationalizes the ambitions of the Green Deal and is critical to the EU's climate agenda. We will also have the opportunity to address other important and timely topics, including the recent farmers' protests, the criticism and political challenges facing the European Green Deal, as well as the implications and prospects for the future development of the EU climate governance. With that in mind, Professor Oberthur, I'm truly grateful to have you with us today. We greatly look forward to your insights. And if you wish, and to help structure your presentation and the discussion that will follow, you might begin by outlining the main objectives and key components of the European Green Deal and the Fit-for-55 package. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlos, and thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure, obviously, to be with you at the conference in this particular setting. So let me perhaps try to start with the European Green Deal as such, and just highlighting a couple of components. First thing to understand is, I think, that it's an overarching strategy that the European Commission launched in late 2019. And it doesn't have actually a closing date or so. So we are still with the European Green Deal, although it was at the beginning of the legislative term 2019 and 2024. So really was kind of the guiding strategy of the Commission in that legislative term. It is not actually just a strategy for climate and the environment and climate and environmental policy. But it is a strategy, it was conceived as a strategy by the Commission for the EU as a whole, a growth strategy. So also an economic strategy, something that is cross-cutting across all the sectoral policies that the EU is pursuing. So as regards, and I think you mentioned that already, as regards the environmental agenda, it's also not only climate, but the broader sustainability agenda. It is about food and agriculture, about biodiversity, nature protection, about chemicals, etc., what have you. But it's certainly also true that at its core is climate and the climate objectives. So the key climate objectives of the EU to become climate neutral by 2050. But then also to upgrade its 2030 greenhouse gas emission reduction target to, well, in the Green Deal, it said 50 to 55%. As it turned out, it was in the end 55%. And that is from a pre-existing target before the Green Deal that was a 40% emission reduction by 2030. So with that basis, I can go on to the Fit-for-55 package, because well, just mentioning that the 2030 target is now 55% emission reduction. The Fit-for-55 legislative package is clearly to implement this upgraded 55% emission reduction target. The package as such was launched in 2021 and was finalized in 2023, 2024. So with one exception, I'll come back to that later, the legislative files have been adopted by the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament, together with the European Commission that proposed them, obviously. And it's about 20 legislative files. Well, I've written about this in an article, etc., and we actually had 19 legislative instruments identified. It's not an exact science, because what do you count as contributing to the 55% emission reduction target is a little bit, also if you look at the websites of the different European institutions, you sometimes find a little bit differences. So let's say 19, 20 legislative files. And they are supposed to deliver this 55% emission reduction. It is expanding something that also existed before, namely that was called Climate and Energy Policy Framework for 2030, which was to implement the pre-existing 40% emission reduction. But this Fit-for-55 package is much bigger and obviously has to be stronger in order to deliver increased emission reductions. We have had in the EU over the years, first a package for achieving the 2020 emission reduction target, then the 40% for 2030, and now the 55. And this Fit-for-55 package with its 19 instruments, legal instruments, is really the biggest. Before it was growing already from like 4 or 5 in the first stage to 7 or 8, and now 19. It's an enormous scope. And it cuts across different policy sectors. Obviously, emission reductions, you think of climate. Yes, in terms of the EU treaties, in particular the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, you have a mandate there to develop environmental policy. And that climate is a kind of a subcategory of that. So a number of these instruments that have been developed fit under the climate environment mandate of the treaties. But there's also a big chunk that actually addresses energy policy, which has a separate legal basis. And that kind of perhaps seems natural, right? Because climate and energy, everybody can see. But for the first time now, we have as part of the package also transport policy. So a number of instruments of transport policy, and actually a couple of instruments that have a mixed legal base, as we call it, that go into the social field also. Perhaps also important to understand, these are 19 new legal instruments, but a number of them actually just revise or amend existing instruments. So it's not all completely new, but we did have the emissions trading system already in the EU. We've had it since 2005. And this is now strengthening that system to deliver on the 55% emission reduction. But we do also have a number of new instruments. Perhaps just to mention a couple, we have a new regulation that's on something that's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, also the abbreviation CBAM. So that is for actually kind of taxing products that are coming into the EU, energy-intensive products, emission-intensive products, taxing them in accordance to what the production would have to pay under the ETS, the emissions trading system of the EU, at the border, so that they don't have a kind of unfair competitive advantage. So we also have something new, methane regulation that addresses methane emissions from the energy sector in particular. So and there are a couple of new things in there, but also existing ones. I mentioned the emissions trading system. We actually have a core of climate and energy legislation that over the year has been further developed. Perhaps I mentioned those briefly. So the emissions trading directive, the effort sharing regulation that addresses emissions that are not covered by the emissions trading system in the EU. Something called the LULUCF regulation, land use change, and forestry. So it's about forestry and land use. And then in the energy area, the Renewable Energy Directive, the Energy Efficiency Directive, and the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. So these are core instruments that had been part of the 2030 framework before and have now been strengthened in the Fit-for-55 package and complemented with other instruments. So yes, perhaps I stop here for a moment and give you the chance to ask a further question. Otherwise, I can elaborate a little bit on some other elements of the Fit-for-55 package if you wish.
No, it's quite clear. Thank you. The overview of what is the European Green Deal and the Fit-for-55 package. I was wondering about the implementation of the European Green Deal and the problems that we can have regarding the implementation of these two packages and the very many instruments that we have. Also, because we are in a very important moment for climate policy in Europe, a lot of things are happening at the moment that could change things. For example, we have seen the widespread farmers' protest, which have highlighted the growing concerns about climate change regulations, how they are affecting the agricultural sector. Also, this has fed into a broader backlash against climate policies in some parts of Europe. At the same time, there are efforts underway like the omnibus or simplifications packages that aim to streamline the EU legislation, and it's causing as well rolling back key environmental protections. For example, there have been recent pushes to weaken the CO2 standards for cars. We have also seen how the growing political attacks on the European Green Deal, that this was not already there when it was created, when it was developed. So all of this raises serious questions such as what lies ahead of EU climate governance, how resilient it is, how ambitious it can be, is it going to be properly implemented, and what changes might we see in the years to come. So there are many questions, but there are also many policies, and I wanted to know what do you think about all of this?
Difficult questions. Perhaps let me start with where are we? Kind of, if you look and evaluate the Fit-for-55 package, it should, in principle, that's what the analyses show, it should be sufficient to deliver the 55%, which is kind of the first question. Where are we, right? It should be okay, but the but is, and you kind of refer to that, it needs to be kind of fully implemented to deliver. And that is obviously not a given by adopting legislation. Yeah, afterwards the member states need to implement it. There needs to be further follow-up at the EU level to elaborate. Perhaps I should also mention once more, one of the instruments hasn't been adopted yet, and that is about energy taxation levels. And that is obviously because any taxation rules in the EU require unanimity. That's different from the normal majorities that you need to pass environmental climate legislation. So that one is not there yet, and if ever it gets adopted, it's pretty clear that it will probably not be very far-reaching and kind of underperform to what perhaps the Commission had in mind when it proposed it in 2021. And then there are a couple of challenges. Some of them are, as you mentioned, the political ones. There is more skepticism, political difficulties. You referred to the CO2 in cars that has been, just in the implementation of it, slightly weakened. And what comes with these omnibus packages that you also mentioned, so sold as simplification, but then slight weakening, these have actually not yet concerned the core of the Fit-for-55 package. It's other bits and pieces of the environmental and sustainability and climate agenda, but the core of the Fit-for-55 has not been really touched. The one element that has been touched, that is in the legislative process, is the CBAM, which has been simplified, but most experts agree that it is really a simplification because it's because of the transaction costs that are involved for companies. The smallest companies are kind of taken out of it, and that takes out 1% of the emissions and saves them the costs of reporting, etc., that you also have, and it's that field. So this is really difficult politically, also because some of the attacks that are there, political attacks on the European Green Deal, are, in my view, in my analysis, to some extent really ideological, because the Green Deal 5 years ago was the big thing and everybody thought about it positively. Now, in Brussels, at least, sometimes it's difficult to use the term European Green Deal because you will immediately be attacked. Oh, it's this green thing, right? Although, as I said at the beginning, it's a growth strategy. So it's also supposed to make economic sense. And some of the proposals that are there are actually not necessarily making economic sense. There are calls to further weaken CO2 and car rules, although they are clearly directed also to give a push to the industry and say the electric vehicles are the future. And all the experts in that field say that's the future. So going back on that will probably be also economically disadvantaged. And yeah, so investments, economy also needs legal certainty to know where we're traveling. If we're changing every 3 or 4 years and say, okay, now it's a little bit in a different direction, that doesn't necessarily make economic sense. So there's the policy side of it, but there's also the evidence-based side of it. And perhaps to say a few words about that, and that's perhaps one of the things to watch most, is are we pursuing policies on a clear basis of evidence? Many of the legislative proposals that the Commission has now put forward to simplify the omnibus package, even the CO2 and cars package, have not been done in the normal procedure. The normal procedure in the EU legislation foresees that the Commission undertakes an impact assessment. So analyzes the different aspects. What are the impacts on the environment? What are the impacts on the economy? What are the social impacts, etc.? And that enables you to make an informed decision and say, okay, we understand what we are doing. We're opting for this one, for this solution. Now, going away from that and saying, oh, it's so urgent, we don't do the impact assessment is obviously inherently dangerous, because you may then listen to particular lobbies who say this is really urgent and we're suffering, and you may take decisions that do not make good economic, environmental, etc. sense. So that's something to watch, in particular, something that I'm slightly concerned about, because good policy making should take the evidence and try with all the evidence to take good decisions for the environment, for the economy. And as I said, the Green Deal is the idea that these matters can be combined in a fruitful way. And I think in some areas we also see that that is possible. And then that we shouldn't then play the economy necessarily against the environment and climate, but that we can have both at the same time. The Commission has said, the Commission President, that she intends to stay the course, as she said, on the Green Deal targets, etc. But the new Commission has also put a different emphasis. It has emphasized much more competitiveness, industrial development, and implementation of policies. So not that much new targets, new policies, etc., but implementing what we have there. Obviously, what we have seen is mentioning more competitiveness has been used by some of saying, okay, then less environment, rather than trying to see how can we use environment to strengthen our economy and the other way around, which is something, the Commission has then presented the Clean Industrial Deal, which is kind of the new program for the next 5 years, which tries to combine competitiveness and at least the climate agenda. So perhaps to kind of summarize that bit, I think we are in a way at the crossroads, at a precarious moment in the development of EU climate governance and policy and law, where it's not exactly clear whether we'll see a policy dismantling that's really serious. But there is certainly a danger that more of that may happen, and there are requests from lobbies, etc., certain political factions to weaken the core elements also of the Fit-for-55 package. Perhaps I should still say a couple of words, if you allow, on the future agenda, because I just said, so no new targets, but we need new targets. So the Commission is supposed to come forward even before the summer still with a proposal for a 2040 greenhouse gas emission reduction target, which it kind of has also committed to that should be at least 90% emission reduction. It was supposed to present this target already for a long time, but it has taken until now and has now taken, in view of the new politics of things, also another time to think about how that target should be framed. It has namely said, okay, perhaps we can include in that target something called carbon removals, be it by forests, be it by technologies, and thereby get a little bit of flexibility into the 90%. And perhaps we should consider also international carbon credits that are now kind of also operational under Paris Agreement since last year. So perhaps also being able to fulfill some part of the target, the commitment, through international action. So we'll have to see how that proposal exactly looks like for 2040. And in that context, also important, the EU does need to table a new nationally determined contribution, as it's called, for under the Paris Agreement for 2035. And that obviously hinges on an understanding of what the 2040 target may be, and then what the trajectory to the 2040 target might be, a linear trajectory, or what should it be. And that NDC was actually due to be presented already in February, but now the new deadline is September, so that it is available for the next conference of the parties of the Paris Agreement later in November, December. I think that is scheduled. So there are things to watch there. And once the target has been clarified for 2040, it also will need to be implemented. So there is on the horizon a new legislative package that would need to ensure that the EU can also meet its 2040 target. But first things first, the target needs to be defined. Back to you, Carlos.
So in the end, there are many challenges that the climate policy is facing. You mentioned policy dismantling. Also, that we need more legal certainty to take a look at the impasse assessment in order also to avoid, I think, this skepticism and to focus on science. To have informed decisions based on science and what are the problems behind. Also, when I'm taking a look at this nature restoration regulation, I'm also seeing that there are also some problems when they want to implement it and try to avoid the problems that they have with the habitats and best directives and so on. So in the end, we have we need more legal certainty to take a look at the impasse assessments, also to implement the policies and policy coherence on what we are doing and implementing properly the objectives, and also take a look at the international agenda and at the 2040 targets. So how are we going to, is it going to change how we work with the national determined contributions? Do we have to work differently? And also, when you were talking about this policy dismantling, what I'm seeing is that, coming back to the political debates, that there are divisions or politicization and polarization of the actors. So how can we address these divisions? It's only through science, through implementation. How are we going to strengthen this societal cohesion and build a broader consensus about how to make this climate transition work? Because we are seeing, as you said, many problems, many challenges that we are facing. I'm asking many questions, but just to...
I'll select a few thoughts that I have on this, obviously. It's also true what you said, also in this field, that there are obviously issues when you pass so many legislative instruments and you pass them in 2023, and then the world moves on and there are new developments, to keep them kind of updated and flexible and adjust them. Like, as I said, the CBAM regulation, it's now probably going to be amended so that it doesn't apply to the smallest companies. Perhaps that just makes sense, and is not as such a major weakening. But the issue is always what is of that kind, that one can say, okay, that makes sense. Also, how the hydrogen market now develops. In a couple of years ago, we thought it would be much more hydrogen. Now we think it's a little bit less. So perhaps there needs to be flexibility to adapt things. But in some areas might make sense. The question is always, to what extent are you opening the floodgates for those who said, you see, we should abandon the whole thing because there was a thing that was not optimal, which is pretty normal in legislation, as you all know, I guess. So how do we do this? First, perhaps I just repeat what I already said. I think making sure that we start from an evidence base, that it's not just people shouting and saying, we should do this, we should do that, but really have proper impact assessments that will also give, as I said before, the certainty to the economic investment community that they say, okay, we know they are doing proper policies, that they're making them in a targeted way, and it's not kind of just from one day to the other that it's completely different. The second thing perhaps to understand that I would say is, because there's sometimes these calls for a pause, a break, or even sometimes going backwards. I don't think there is a way of going backwards. With the car example, right, to suddenly say, okay, let's go back to the combustion engine. If the rest of the world, the car industry is global and international and competing internationally, if that's the way to go, and in a couple of years, electric vehicles are just cheaper, then that's just not good. And obviously, evidence-based impact assessment should bring that out. But also, there are a number of other energy security benefits that you have if you're not that much relying on gas and oil anymore, etc. All of that, bringing that into the picture. Then there's the social aspect of it, and we haven't really mentioned that. The just or fair transition. There are instruments at the EU level that are available, that were actually also part of the Fit-for-55 package, something called the Social Climate Fund, that is trying to address that through especially financial means. And there's certainly scope to do more, to also enhance the acceptance and make it clear to the citizens that also the social aspect is being seen, so that, as it's then said, nobody is left behind. Right? So that's certainly an important part of the agenda, to also get acceptance. But then perhaps what I'm very much busy with thinking about is also, how do we involve the public and citizens directly in this, so that it's not only that it's in the evening in the news or so, but that they get involved. So that would mean more public participation, meaningful, and that doesn't necessarily mean only EU climate governance, right? That needs to be about the implementation in member states, even in cities, etc. So how do we get in through this process also, and how do we ensure that there's always a diversity of views? In my experience, and that's also what the research says, involving different views, different backgrounds in policy making just improves policy making. Makes the policies better, makes them more accepted, but also actually makes them better. So how do we develop the system of public participation and citizen involvement in policy making so that we perhaps address both, get greater acceptance of the climate transition and the measures to be taken in that regard, but also just improve the policies, because policies can be improved at the European level, but also at member state level and local level, etc. So at all levels, kind of. So I don't know whether that is a comprehensive answer to your question, but it's a couple of elements, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
Have any follow-up from you?
Yeah, thank you. No, you were making me think about the Aarhus Convention and the Aarhus Regulation and the integration of environmental aspects onto the requirements of the society. We can have an experience on that. Also, it made me thinking how the policy worked in the 90s, that there were many instruments, many environmental instruments, and now we're going to adjusting and to deleting what is not necessary and to focus on objectives. So if we take a look on the last 30 years of the development of the EU environmental climate and environmental policy, we can see that we are reorienting these objectives. So this brings me to the question of the future. What do you think is going to happen in the future? We are going to align the objectives, integrating environmental and climate requirements in all the policies as it is happening in the moment. And what can we do to improve these 2040 targets? So I know that you were talking about some ideas that we have to develop. But how do you see that? Where are we going? Is it going to be a success, the European Green Deal? What do we have to do in addition?
This is looking into the crystal ball to some extent.
Yeah.
I don't have particularly good experience with doing that, because usually when you say, okay, I think it will go to this direction, the next day something happens in the world that makes it go into a completely different direction. Wars, pandemics, and what have you. So it's rather difficult to foresee. I think, obviously, in the political situation in which we are, people are looking at less regulation. That's kind of what you hinted at. Perhaps more target setting. At the same time, I think if you look back in history, usually objectives are not enough, especially if there's no stick or no instrument behind them to make actors implement them. There's a plethora of targets that have been agreed with the car manufacturers, etc., voluntary agreements, and then they're not implemented. We are a little bit in danger of doing that again. You see that in some of the member states that don't abandon their long-term targets, say, yes, we're committed to the targets, but then cut some of the policies, and then the scientific advisors are left with saying, guys, you're not going to get there with this, just with wishful thinking and saying, but we kept the targets. So that do need to be policies in place. And that is perhaps kind of coming back to the Fit-for-55 package. That's a lot of the rationale of the Fit-for-55 package is, yes, we need to also develop the policies to actually get to the targets, right? So if you extrapolate that to the 2040, you would think, okay, there will need to be further measures to fine-tune in certain areas and say, okay, buildings is not going that well, transport is not going that well, so we do this or that additional measures and policies and incentives, but perhaps also regulation. So that will be extremely interesting to see. Perhaps also to mention there was one important economic instrument added in the Fit-for-55 package, that is the so-called ETS2, the emissions trading system for buildings and transport. That will come into operation in the coming years if nothing else happens in terms of dismantling or so. And will be extremely interesting to see whether this market-based economic instrument will work properly. Because that would mean also that, perhaps that's behind your question also, targets with economic instruments, will that be a recipe to advance us more than lots of regulation, etc.? So we'll have to watch that. But in principle, I think it's fair to say we will need a fair amount of EU legislation to implement the 2040 targets, meaning EU legislation also updating existing one.
What you said before, flexibility and to adapt to the necessities and to check what are the objectives and to align everything. We have covered a lot of topics, and it's beginning to open more and more topics. But I wanted to thank you for having you here, and thank you so much, Professor Oberthur, for sharing your insight with us. It has been a pleasure to hear your thoughts. As I said, we have covered from the European Green Deal to the EU climate governance, and it's clear that there is still a lot of work ahead, but also a lot of potential for progress. We will see how it develops in the future. As I said, thank you again for being with us. I really appreciate your time and expertise. If you want to add something else, and also to our audience, thank you for joining us as well. And I hope you find this discussion informative and thought-provoking.
My pleasure, and looking forward to continuing these debates on other occasions. Great.
So thank you. Let's keep the conversation going on as we continue working towards a sustainable future. Thanks again.
Thanks. Thank you.